how does Ayehu integrate itself with Cherwell? And really, how does Ayehu on the orchestration automation side simplify the ability to orchestrate as well as integrate with other third-party systems? Up front, when looking at Cherwell, everything has been built based off of the Cherwell REST API. So as a user, I really have no or minimal tasks for really setting up the integration. And I'm going to walk you through that right now. So as a Yahoo user, you're going to log into your web-based client, which I can have up right now. And to deploy an integration directly with Cherwell, it really only needs a couple points of data points. Um, and those data points all come from Cherwell. So upfront, as long as I know where the shareable server resides, and that's what the URL represents. It represents the RESTful API endpoint, and then the client ID and the user account. With only those details, I can automatically set up the integration within a Ayehu NG to allow me to automate the discovery of new records or updates, as well as push data back in a form of creating a new record, updating a record, adding a journal entry, as well as managing attachments. So if there's an attachment I need to download in an automation and read, that's also available to you out of the box. Now, for those who are existing Sharewell customers, where do I get some of that data? So I'm going to take a quick little switch over to our Sharewell instance here and bring up the Sharewell CSM administrator client. So for those who have access to the administrator client, where do I get the user account and where do I get the client ID? So for those who need the client ID, it's specifically going to the task for editing the REST API client status. From there, you can generate a key specific to the Yahoo integration as you see here. Copying that client key and the user account, I simply would go into the UI of a Yahoo NG and add those details. As those details are entered, I will go ahead and validate my connection. And once that comes back with a green check mark, I have already done and set up my integration. So within a couple seconds, to depending on how long it takes you to log in, you've now built and Sharewell and a Yahoo NG are completely bidirectional and set up to with the integration, just using those two steps. Now, now that I have the connection built, what can I do? So the second phase of the integration setup is to define those types of attributes that I'm going to be working with in the integration itself. So in the upper right hand corner, we have an expand or an extend option, which now presents the list of items that have either been discovered already. And as this is my lab instance here, I already have a couple points. But the business objects that you have access to are all available to you as a drop down. So once I have the first setup and the connection, I can now discover and really interact bidirectionally with any business object that you have granted access to from the user account. This covers all of the standard business objects as well as any customized standard objects that you can discover automatically into the product. For those that are discovered upfront already, for example, my incident, I've discovered it, and I've also denoted that I wanted to be able to automate discovery because there are two pieces that are very important to understand in discovery of objects within Cherwell. The first is the discovery of the business object and the attributes or the fields behind it for use in workflow, which we'll get to shortly. And the second ability of the integration is, do I want to also automate the events that are submitted or updated to create an event in the Yahoo system to trigger an automated workflow? And that's what these remaining four checkboxes represent. Do I want to monitor and in what interval? And you can see here I've set up with the value of 10, which represents 10 seconds as your minimum available interval. Ideally, in a production environment, you're typically going to query or set up the monitor interval from 30 to 60 seconds. But for our lab and test instance, we'll leave it at 10 seconds. Now, after I've done a discovery of a business object, what would be the next logical step? The next logical step is, if I am going to monitor, which particular records do I want to have automation activities tied to? Ideally, in a typical environment, every incident is not going to require an automated action. So we do also give you the ability to mitigate some of that traffic and some of that noise by setting up filters. So in the secondary tab that I'm selecting here, now allows me to define a filter, which I would give a filter name. And because the discovery has all been done through the API, I also now have access to all of the fields that have been defined in that business object as a dropdown. So from this particular interface here, I can now set up a very custom rule of which specific incident I want the Ayehu NG system to auto discover by simply selecting the dropdowns. And it allows me to select any of the standard or customized fields as well, are all available to me in a dropdown. Okay. All right, so let's go and switch over to the second part. So this is the first part of just setting up and defining the integration, which particular business objects I'm going to be interacting with. And now that I've also discovered other business objects, I can also leverage them in workflow design. So switching over to our workflow designer, I'll give a brief introduction into the designer for those who are new to our product. This is the palette that allows you to define all of the workflows. It's a complete drag and drop system. You also have other abilities, which I'll show shortly, of being able to add content to the workflow. But up front, this is what really simplifies the need for building complex orchestrations all through a UI interface. On the left hand side, we provide all of the out of box activities that allow you to build the full process or the workflow for yourself. In those areas that we have an integration out of the box, like Cherwell, there is a specific category with specific actions that you can execute. So at any point I wanted to add a journal entry, I simply left click that specific activity and place it at that point I want that activity to execute. And then the next step is to configure it, which I would click on the little wrench and screwdriver, which now presents to me the properties in somewhat of a wizard fashion of what I need to enter in for me to successfully execute that action. In terms of a Sharewell activity, I simply pick which Sharewell integration point, because the system does allow me to connect to multiple in a single tenant, and then define which form that I have discovered. So if I wanted to add a journal entry into an incident, I simply select the incident. Then I select the ID type. We do represent for Sharewell specifically the public ID as well as the rec ID if you have that. And then simply entering in the properties. Any other custom properties that I'd want to define are also available, just similar to the way the filter was set up, all done through a dropdown. So there is no need for me to kind of memorize or programmatically define the attributes I want to update. They're all given to you in the UI as a simple dropdown that I may access. Now, the data that I want to pass the particular property, those can be done statically by typing, or more importantly, I can also pass data dynamically. Data is passed dynamically within Ayehu NG simply by making a variable references. All variables within our platform are referenced by the percent sign. So as soon as I hit the percent sign as a character, we present to you the list available outputs or variables. There are three different scopes to the variables, from activities to global, and more importantly, the modules. Modules represent our integrations. So this is where I can really access the data that's already been pre-discovered. So if this was based on an incident and I wanted to pull the current event details into my activity, I simply can choose that attribute, and it will place that reference to that particular value. And such, the workflow itself is now completely modular, where the data that's fed to the workflow will automatically allow you to execute the action on any node, any user, or any particular type of data points, as long as the data is represented in the variable that you've entered in. Okay. Let me just remove that from my workflow. And let's go through two different examples here. So one of the first examples that we're going to run through live is representing a server alert. So I'm going to create a simulated alert through our SolarWinds environment. And then secondarily, I'm also going to go through an interaction with a Slack bot, as Guy had mentioned. It is really kind of moving towards from the service portal down to using our chat bots as well. So up front, let's go ahead and log into our other application here. And I'm going to go ahead and trigger a automated alert through our SolarWinds system by just stopping a service here. So what's going to happen next? So there are two integration points that this particular scenario will interact with. Up front, we're actively monitoring the monitoring system, which in this specific instance will be SolarWinds. Once we get that event, there are actions that I want to take. The actions in the orchestration can be from the creation of the Cherwell ticket, which would be one of the first actions, down to the automated remediation steps from, is this a false alert? So we want to validate if it's a true alert. We also want to pull data. So we do some forensic steps. And then after those steps or actions have been taken, what types of remediation actions may we execute in the workflow itself? So that full profile from the alert being discovered down to the remediation and the ticket that's been created in Cherwell are all done in a single workflow. And that workflow is actually shown here above. But before we dive into a little more details of the workflow, let's go over to our logger. So our view of the audit trail. So every event that is discovered, and I can see the alert is already been triggered here. Every event that is received is audited in our product as well. Along with every event that is audited, every individual step or the action is also audited. So as you can see here in real time, there are multiple steps that have occurred. So upfront, we've received the alert from the monitoring tool. The details of that alert are all captured, and I can select that here from the message, which represents all the data points that have now been provided to the system from the monitoring tool itself. And what this really represents for a visual aspect is all these attributes are actually all variables that are accessible in the workflow. So kind of think of that modular concept of the workflow. All the data points are really variables that I can now use downstream in the workflow to allow me to manage this particular scenario. After it's gone through the first point, we want to do a check. So we want to check. This is specific to a portal. We actually have a portal, a website that was monitored. So obviously, because I stopped the IIS service, the portal is down. So we've gone ahead and validated it through a URL check. The next steps that included in the workflow is to also query the Cherwell Cmdb, because it is a business object that you have access out of the box. So what we can do is we can query the Cmdb for, in this particular instance, I was looking to confirm what the internal or the record ID for the asset that is impacted, so that I can update the Cherwell incident appropriately with the configuration item, so we can tie in all of the relationships appropriately. But also in that same aspect, I can also pull back the owner or the owned by attribute as well. So what I have up here is all the data points from that get. So using the standard out-of-box Cherwell activity that allows me to pull data using the get record, I was able to look up the CI and pull back all the attributes of that CI for me to now use downstream, again, as variables, which then allowed me to create the incident. Our incident number is 102492. So I'm going to now take that and switch over to our browser. And let's take a look at that shareable incident. All right, so here it is. So what we have here is the automated incident that was created with all the data points that were dynamically created. And also reference to the CI, we've gone ahead and placed that in the CI, so updating the relationship. And then throughout the progress of that workflow, it went ahead and added multiple journal entries as it got to different points in the workflow execution. In the workflow execution, it was less than a minute. So it went from being able to receive the event and notify as a journal entry that it received the alert, it will begin its analysis. It's done some initial forensics, so we're able to pull some data from the host, the CPU, the disk space available, and all those points are out of box actions or out of box activities, all the way to the remediation. So it was able to remediate. And then if I wanted to, I could also close the ticket as well. I left it open for the webinar, so we can leave it in the default view for open incidents, but it is an action that you can do. Now, all of this that was completed in less than a minute is all represented by the single workflow. So jumping back to the workflow designer, let's take a look at how some of those actions were created. Okay, so that first instance I'd referred to is how do I query the Cmdb within Cherwell? I simply use the Cherwell out-of-box activity called Cherwell get record, which allows me to look up the configuration item business object, which refers to us as a form, by host name, which is a dynamic value from the alert. So the caption is the variable from the Orion alert that we received. So it allowed me to dynamically look up that particular CI item and return back the data points. Then after that, I went ahead and created the Cherwell incident. The creation of a Shareable incident was used with the standard out-of-box create record activity, and I was able to update multiple properties, as you can see here. The properties, again, are all available to you as drop-down. If there's other properties that you need to update in the creation or the update type action, again, this covers all the standard and customized fields, and then all the value points or the data points that I've entered in. After it's gone through and done the creation of the incident, it went through some forensics. So it went ahead and pinged the server to make sure the server was up. It went through some other forensic type activities, which again are all out of box activities that I can collect, all the way down to the remediation step here. And then finally, updating the last journal entry that it was able to validate that the website was back up, and it was able to update with the last journal entry here. So that kind of summarizes really how the automation was able to go from the alert discovery down to remediation, and in parallel to the analysis and remediation, create a Cherwell incident record and update the Cherwell incident throughout that whole process, which took under a minute to complete. Um, One of the other areas really around the workflow designer is that it is really a white box solution, as you can see here. So there are many templates that we offer as a starting point. But one of the biggest assets that you will see from the orchestration piece is that you have all the out-of-box content that allows me to build my workflows based on my processes and based on the environment that I have. Okay, so let's switch over to a different scenario here. So taking a end user type of request, which Guy kind of represented as one of the top 10 scenarios or use cases around password resets. So what other ways can we get a password reset completed? And there's been a lot of talk about chatbots. So our next interface with an integration point would be with Slack as a chatbot, which again will also be integrated directly and seamlessly with Cherwell as the ITSM platform to document and escalate if necessary if there's other issues that the orchestration was unable to complete. So upfront, we want to do is introduce ourselves into the chatbot. So we'll start with a trigger word, which kind of kicks off the conversation with the chatbot. So our chatbot is named Toby in our lab instance here. So let's go ahead and kick off the Shareable password demo. So what's important to understand as the conversation is completed with the chatbot, you're in the background actually bidirectionally communicating with the workflow. So in the previous workflow we executed based on the server alert, that was all automated, meaning there was no human action from start to finish. It was all done in the back end. In this type of scenario, a workflow is now being interacted by the end user, which is myself, through the chatbot here. So I'm going to ask for a reset of a password, which is going to then ask me for the particular area. So I'm going to head and choose Active Directory. So now it's going to kick off and validate, do I have an Active Directory account? Well, it's also going to do some two-factor authentication here as well. So the first thing, it's going to ask me for my social security number, which is not 1234. So I know this is recorded. All right, so after we've entered in a number, again, going back into the workflow, it is going ahead and connecting directly to our backend, which is Active Directory, to validate that my social security number that I've entered in is appropriate. That can also be integrated into an HR system as well, if necessary, based off of your needs of the data validation. After it's gotten the verification from the individual, it went ahead and reset my password, gave me a temp password, and in that process, also created the Cherwell ticket. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Cherwell ticket. So going back to the Cherwell browser, let's go ahead and look at the request. So unlike the original, which was a server alert, which we generated an incident, our password reset is generated as a service request. And so here it is. So very similarly as the server alert, we use the out-of-box activities that allowed us to automate the creation and the population of the appropriate service request with the details. And we also went ahead and completed it with confirming that the temp password was sent to you, as well as the authorization through the social security number. So that was actually all done through a workflow within a matter of seconds, from the conversation through the chatbot down to the resolution through the backend workflow that was able to connect and communicate with Active Directory.